Kalee Kreider is a nationally recognized expert in environmental policy, technology, and communications. She served for 6 years as environmental advisor and communications director for former President Al Gore, Vice President Al Gore. Please welcome Kalee as the moderator of today's panel.
As someone who worked on An Inconvenient Truth, there's nothing I love more than a former elected official with a PowerPoint. So thank you so much for that kind introduction. I'd like to invite our panelists up to take their seats. And as I do that, I'd also like to let folks know that we are taking questions on note cards. I'll do my best to get to as many of them as I can, and I will cluster topics together so as to try to get to as many of them as I possibly can. I'd like to also introduce one person who we haven't heard from, which is Hill Huntington. He is really a living icon in scholarly energy economic circles and is credited with a long list of published energy economic works, which I won't delve into here. As past president of the U.S. Association for Energy Economics, he now serves as head of the Stanford Energy Modeling Forum. He also acted as the senior advisor to the National Energy Policy Institute project under discussion today. I want to thank you for traveling all this way for today's event. And I'm going to ask you the first question since we haven't had a chance to hear from you yet. When you and the NEPI team set out to build on the previous report, tell me a little bit about what you were looking to accomplish. Was there a single goal or a set of principles that guided your work?
Yes, I think there were. I remember distinctly when the governor came out to Stanford. You were there for another meeting, I think, but you stopped by and talked to us and talked to me directly about what we should try to do. And the thing that struck me was this notion of a cost-effective strategy for climate issues. I mean, we've had so many talks about how it's really our imperative that we do it, but I always felt that people were reluctant to do anything on this until they knew something more about what the costs were. And so that struck a real dynamo in my thought. And in fact, when I think about it, as some of you can tell, I've been around for a while. I have white hair to prove it. But the thing that has struck me in my 40 years of looking at energy policy is one statistic which is really outstanding, I think. It's that our economic growth in this country has grown about 6 times faster than the amount of delivered energy we've had. Now that's a phenomenal difference. And why is that? I mean, it's not due to any particular energy czar in Washington. It's due to the fact that market forces were working in a direction that actually had a good outcome. So then you start asking the question, well, what if we use the same kind of notion about market instruments and start thinking about trying to reduce our oil vulnerability, reduce our exposure to damages from carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, and other emissions like NOx and sulfur dioxide. And so I thought this was exactly what I thought needed to be done, was to go for a policy that would really be cost effective. So that's the first issue. The second issue that I think that the governor and I talked about was he didn't want to just sit down and just say this was the answer. He wanted to try to use a formal modeling system to try to do this. And I explained all the strengths and limitations of any existing models, and he said that's okay. He wanted a consistent story. He wanted a consistent set of assumptions so we could go to and we could tell people that. Moreover, he wanted a model that people seemed to understand, particularly here in Washington. And so that model was actually, as he described it, the National Energy Modeling System. So, and we had these discussions about, well, we're not trying to forecast energy, we're just trying to understand what different policies will do, and importantly, we wanted to know how different policies when you combine them, how they would operate. So I think those are the kinds of issues that we felt were really important to try to get across. Plus, he was willing to get good people involved in special issues, which he went over very quickly on the slide, but those were really good people who were working on some of these issues. So all of those were attractive to me.
I'm just going to ask a quick follow-up to that. I had a chance to see the whole study perhaps a bit earlier than others in the audience, and there's quite a bit of data and research that you all have put out today, particularly in some of the new research on the oil rebate and the clean energy standard. I'm old enough to have been around when it was we went through the RPS and the RES, and now, but the clean energy standard research and the oil rebate, talk a little bit about how you think this might be a starting point for perhaps some future energy work, or what you think might come out of this down the road.
Well, let me just say quickly, I think we've already had one big impact, and that is on the LNG truck issue. This was an issue that people weren't talking a lot about a year or two ago, or a couple of years ago. But it was the NEPI's original effort actually got people talking about this issue. And I think now you go over to the Energy Information Administration and they will readily admit that they're looking aggressively at these issues. So that's already happened. On the clean energy standard, lots of people are evaluating the things that look very much like the clean energy standard now, so that's becoming quite popular. The appeal of the clean energy standard, of course, is that it broadens the appeal. You're not just looking at one kind of technology, you're looking at, or kinds of technologies, you're looking at a set of technologies. So I think that's already happening, and the oil dividends tax has been really quite an intriguing issue. I was surprised, actually, myself, at how beneficial some of these tax recycling issues can be. But I think that's an issue that's going to continue to be looked at, and I think other efforts are going to address those kinds of issues. And by the way, it's valuable to get other models to start evaluating the same issues. And when you start to see a number of models coming up with similar kinds of answers, that gives you a little more confidence that everything is going to come out the way they are. But I think this analysis was very, very eye-opening.
Governor, tell us what should the audience take away from the report? If you could script it for them to walk out of the room, tell us what should they take away when they leave today?
Well, I think the most important message that I believe this report generates is that we have available low-cost, viable policies that can effectively reduce our imported oil and carbon dioxide emissions. And if we have that, then we do truly have within our reach a energy plan that we can afford and moves us forward to achieve very broad national goals. So those are the two messages, as well as some of the mind-numbing numbers that we came up with.
So Heather, I think we all know that you're the hardest working person in Washington on climate and energy policy. I think we're all absolutely impressed that you're here after the amazing week on these set of issues. So tell us a little bit about, so first of all, congratulations on an amazing week. We'd love to know a little bit more about what's next for you and the White House. It feels like we have a 3-year plan now, but we'd love to hear what you're able to share with us about what comes next.
Well, I think taking a big step back, if you look at some of the recommendations that were put forth from the Institute, we know what works. We know energy efficiency works. We know increasing the fuel economy of our cars and trucks work. We know transitioning to LNG works. All of these things are readily available, off-the-shelf technologies that can drive emissions reductions, save consumers money, and reduce our dependence on oil. You've seen from this president from the very first days that he was in office, his willing to roll up his sleeves and get to work. And if you look at the carbon action plan or carbon reduction action plan that the White House put out this week, many of those component parts Some things are going to be on a quick timeline for delivery, and as you said, some things are going to take time. When it comes to, as I said, what the heart of the plan is really the work that the EPA is about to embark upon to do the GHG standards for new and existing plants. At the end of the day, I think, in particular for existing facilities, much of what the ultimate outcome can be akin to a clean energy standard. So, just taking a step back, I do think that there's certainly a lot of overlap in terms of how NEPI and the administration are thinking about these challenges. I think what's important to the president is that we know this challenge is here; it's staring us in the face. So you can expect to see consistent action from the administration. Just yesterday, in fact, Secretary Jewell did some important work with USGS to show all the opportunities for carbon sequestration on our federal lands. Might not be like sexy front page New York Times kind of press reporting, but across the administration, we see this as an important job for the Department of Interior, the Department of Energy, EPA, DOD, et cetera. I mean, we are all in across the federal government, and I think you can expect to see, some of these things are going to be on a slow churn, and some of these things are going to be, the EPA work, as you said, is a 2+ year proposition, but we're going to make incremental progress. We're going to be rolling out energy efficiency standards from the Department of Energy for appliances in our homes and businesses. We're going to be permitting new renewables projects on our federal lands across the country. We are going to be doing important work through the DOE to advance clean fossil energy projects. So I think you can expect near-term deliverables, and you can expect that, at the end of the day, we're keeping our eye on the prize. We're focused on the work that the EPA is going to do. But again, this is much like the president's energy agenda. It's an all-of-the-above approach from the administration.
Jim, one of the interesting things, we've talked a little bit about clean energy standards, is how many states have already adopted them. And I've had a number of people say to me that it's not unlike other issues where you have had a number of states already weigh in, and there's so much support in the grassroots. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what's happening a bit in the states on climate and clean energy and technology, and what you're really seeing, because you, in some ways, have your finger on the pulse a little bit on both what's happening. Not only, you talked a bit about young people, but there's also a lot happening nationally on these issues, and what you're seeing sort of in your membership and how you might see that bubbling up in terms of support.
Yeah, it's a great question. If you look at the states right now, there's real work going on at the local level, the state level, to tackle some of these issues. The states are leading in some places that are really important. We are doing a couple different things. I think I mentioned earlier, we're partnering in Illinois and California to run city council campaigns to get cities to adopt some of these standards and really do some good work on the ground that is very motivating for our supporters. And then we're partnering with business to try to create some of the incentives you were talking about that really work and that we can be a national model on. And if you look at, we are very optimistic that through the ballot initiative process and the legislative process in the states, we can continue to have success in changing some of these policies at the state level to really give, Congress both the ability to see how it's working at the state level, and more importantly, to create a political kind of framework to allow Congress to understand that what the president is doing is not only important, but there's a political imperative. 9 months ago, everyone in this room would have thought that immigration reform wouldn't have gotten done. And now it's seen as a political imperative for both parties to do. I think if we can do that on climate change and use the states as a laboratory for that, I think you will see that happen at the federal level as well, especially because you have a president who is absolutely intent on leading on this issue and tackling the real challenges that lay before us.
Thank you. I've gotten in a number of questions. I have several questions here about tax policy, just because it's an issue in Washington that's come up, and they come from a couple of different angles. But One of them relates to whether or not tax policy was analyzed as part of, whether or not some of these might be moved as part of a tax package, meaning could LNG be part of a tax package? Were there looked at extension of the production tax credit for wind? Just a lot of questions about whether or not if a tax bill moves, I think, could there potentially be a vehicle to move some pieces that might help either with renewables or other pieces on LNG as part of a tax bill. Bit of a wonky question. Anybody want to take a swing at that? Or did you most?
I'll take a quick jump at it. The policies that we took a look at are certainly not prescriptive, they're exemplary. But I think for any other policies to stand the test, it has to show me the numbers. So when you say, well, how about a tax credit for this? Well, model it, see what it's going to cost, see what it is by best estimates could achieve, and what the cost effectiveness is, and how far is the scale of it also get you to where your target is. So you need to set a target. How many tons of CO2 do you want to reduce, and how many barrels of oil per day do you want to reduce? And so that's the framework that you have to put all of the tax questions. There's lots of people that would love to have tax breaks on lots of things, and some of them may be very good. So let's look at them, but look at them with a discipline so that we can get a true comparison as to what is the least cost approach, because that's the way the American public, I think, will buy it.
And I think just to build on that, to sort of combine my world with Jim Messina's world for a minute, one of the interesting things about two of the tax credits you mentioned, the production tax credit and some of the energy efficiency credits that the Institute called out in their report. The interesting thing about those is that they have bipartisan support, and in Washington these days, there aren't a lot of policies that have a lot of bipartisan support, but I think that these two in particular are seen as moving the ball forward on a broader energy and climate initiative, but also doing it in a way that creates jobs, is good for American consumers, and at the end of the day, any policies that are going to move the needle, create jobs, and have bipartisan support are something that we view as the sweet spot and are certainly focused on advancing from the administration's perspective.
I actually interpreted the question a little differently, and that was that it seemed like the question was there were a lot of policies that could fit in a tax framework handled by groups that are really good at doing tax work, and a lot of people are working on energy like what we're doing here. But what's really hard is to find where the two groups actually get together and can actually make. It seems like the decisions are being made by different groups here in Washington. That was the sense I got from that question, and I don't honestly know if I have a good answer for that kind of a question. But this is one of the intriguing issues from an analytical point of view. You cannot address the tax issue just looking at the NEMS model. The NEMS model doesn't handle that at all. What we actually did in the study was we went to an expert who evaluated these tax implications individually with his own framework. And that's how we actually came up with those results. So I do think from a policy perspective, there is this kind of real challenge between people that these decisions are being made by different groups. Perhaps I'm speaking totally as a Californian and have no idea what's going on here in Washington. But
we love silos in Washington.
Yeah.
It's a very important part.
Can I take a look too?
Yeah.
In my old life, I was the chief of staff for the Senate Finance Committee chairman who deals with taxes, and I've worked on these issues for a long time. And I want to highlight something the governor said. This is another reason why the president's call for comprehensive tax reform is so important. Because right now our tax code is not reflecting today's challenges. And lots of people have gotten tax credits for good reasons that make a lot of sense. But in many ways serves to pick winners and losers here. And that's not the function the tax code should use. We ought to try to incentivize alternative across the spectrum and let the marketplace figure out how to do that. And I think that is really important. It's another reason why tax reform is so important to do.
I think we have some Midwesterners here. I have a couple questions on ethanol. Part one was ethanol considered as part of the study, and they didn't differentiate between first or second generation ethanol. And the second was whether or not ethanol, again, not differentiating between the generation, is it part of the president's global warming plans? So if you all want to address the study maybe first.
Well, in the study, there's been, I think, a great deal of work that's been done about ethanol, and you have to identify the source of the ethanol first, and that would be if it's corn-based ethanol. I think there's been a lot of studies that have been done that have shown that it's not cost-effective, that in fact it may be counter-effective in many ways because of the cost of the corn and the carbon footprint that's associated with that, and so that there's some real problematic difficulties with ethanol in terms of corn-based ethanol. Other biofuels, there is a much greater potential based upon the same analysis that you have to take, a hard, careful analysis of what the total carbon footprint is and what the cost that it generates. And so that's where that would fit in. We did not see anything other than what is already forecast through biofuels and biomass to judge any specific ethanol, but that doesn't mean that it can't be done, but it just needs to be careful that it's done with discipline.
And to answer the question, if you, after you're done reading the Institute's report today, if you haven't already, you should go back and look at the President's plan to reduce carbon pollution. It does actually include advanced second-generation biofuels. We see that not only as an important policy lever for two reasons. One, that it is an important part of a carbon reduction strategy, but also two, getting to the oil consumption and backing out oil imports from the U.S. economy is incredibly important. I think some of the work that we've done at the Defense Department in particular, using the Defense Production Act, has really underscored that we have the ability to demonstrate advanced biofuels, homegrown, U.S.-based, and do it in a way that's cost-effective. And for all those reasons, we certainly believe that that's part of that needs to be part of, and certainly is part of, our broader climate plan.
I have a question on LNG in particular here, which relates to, and I think it gets more digging into the study a bit. They ask about that you've looked at CO2, but they wanted to know in the LNG scenario about methane and the greenhouse gas implications of an LNG switch for heavy trucks.
Well, we actually did not look heavily into that methane issue, methane leakages, I assume they're talking about. We did not look heavily into that issue at that point because our first issue was just to see whether or not the LNG, first of all, we weren't evaluating all of natural gas and all of the shale gas development. We were really looking at the opportunities for the heavy trucks to penetrate the market. And I think that was really what our focus was on. We did no separate, in fact, you'd have to do separate calculations if you were doing it with the NEMS modeling system. You'd have to do separate calculations on that. And we were not trying to address that particular issue, but certainly it's an important issue that's gotten a lot of visibility, and it needs to be addressed.
In looking at LNG for heavy trucks, we did something different than anything else that we could find in the open public market on studies. We actually went to a trucking company that is involved with this equipment, and we asked them what barriers, what economic barriers are in the way of your decision whether to transition from diesel to LNG, and what would be the conditions that you would do it. A really interesting study, which very much goes into a lot of the leakage issues because there's worker safety involved in that as well as CO2 emissions. And there was a thorough analysis of this done, and there's no real easy answers to it. What it does say is that as you proceed along that line, if you want to count it as credits, because it is a domestically produced fuel, and it will definitely decrease the imported oil that we use, and it will have lower nitrogen emissions. It will have significantly lower CO2 emissions than diesel, but you have to watch out that the technology of all of it can assure you of the integrity of your numbers. You can't have a lot of escape either in the production or in the utilization of the fuel and call it a winner without recognizing that.
So I have two broad questions, both kind of hot ones, one particularly as the result of, I think, extreme weather. This is about funding for building community resiliency initiatives. I think this really comes up in the aftermath of, and the question is this: might funds from an infrastructure fund be used, rather than all of it being recycled, for example, to be used to build more resilient communities? In other words, sending money back to individuals is one thing, but I think they're asking, how are we going to fund rebuilding initiatives or more resilient communities? I think they're thinking about this broadly. Maybe all of you have some thoughts on this, because we're seeing more extreme weather, communities in New York, New Orleans, but also in other parts of the country now really facing having to rebuild from storms, but also actually having to put up flood defenses and other kinds of things. It's a broad question, and I thought it might be interesting to ask, because I actually got two questions on it from the audience, so it's obviously on people's minds.
Well, I think going back to the President's plan, we absolutely view the need to help communities prepare for a changing climate as part of our comprehensive approach. I think there is a lot of really important work post-Sandy that Secretary Donovan is leading, not only to look at how do we make sure the investments that we are making there are investments that are not throwing good money after bad. We shouldn't be rebuilding our communities in a way that they're just going to be taken out again. So how best to do that? I think some of the other lessons learned from Sandy was the importance of distributed generation, the importance of rooftop solar. So we've been trying to use some of the funding there to drive, I think, innovative pilots to look at clean energy solutions on the ground and in communities. The broader question about how do we actually deal going forward with billions and billions of dollars of price tags and damages is a good one, and it is a timely one, and something that is impossible to get our head around. I mean, we just in trying to handle the budget to fight wildfires have huge challenges on our end, and it doesn't end there. We're looking at historic weather events, extreme weather events. Certainly is going to pose challenges going into the future. It's something that we are spending a lot of time thinking about within the federal government. But I think in the near term, we are trying to be as innovative and creative as possible. I think we are trying to learn as much as we possibly can in the post-Sandy situation. And I think part of what is also going to be important is this commitment to establish a short-term task force to generate recommendations from state, local, and tribal leaders about what is going to best help communities start to plan today for a changing climate.
It's a matter, I know in Alaska, this is not an answer, but it's just a recognition of the problem and unintended consequences. The village of Kivalina, northwest Alaska, on the Bering Sea, with the melting of the sea ice, fierce winter storms, which before there were no waves, it was all covered with ice. But now the erosion factor with fierce winter and autumn storms that were previously not existent or to erosion issues because of the sea ice now have to move. You have to move whole communities, and it's big dollars. It's a lot involved in that, in addition to the rising of the oceans. So it's a double jeopardy.
I'm going to wrap with a big question. I had a theme, and I would say half of the cards was about how do we move policy on climate and energy in a bipartisan way. And so I'm going to wrap with a broad kind of question, which is how do you all see this report and the President's announcement this week how do we move forward with climate and energy policy, or how does this report contribute to moving energy policy in this country? And what do you see happening over the next 5 or 10 years, and how will the report contribute to it? And maybe we'll just go down the row. Governor, do you wrap? Maybe we'll start with Heather and work this way.
Right. Well, again, I think going back to the recommendations of the report, so many of the ideas embedded there actually do have bipartisan support. Right now, Senators Shaheen and Portman have pending legislation before the Senate on energy efficiency. When we finished the CAFE standards, we had support from Democrats, Republicans, states, labor leaders, environmentalists. LNG trucks, I've heard everybody from Boone Pickens to Secretary Kerry when he was then a senator, and Majority Leader Reid talk about the importance of transitioning our truck fleet to LNG. Climate and energy policy does not have to be a bipartisan fight. I think these issues are in the Beltway DC pundits are very quick to just tag this as a red state or blue state issue. But even the president talked about the wind farms that are being built in Oklahoma and Iowa, and the solar panels that are going up in Utah and Nevada. And, I think that, what we need to do is to, rather than get into a huge fight about, does this huge comprehensive plan work, is to focus on the areas where we know that there is commonality. And, whether it's the NEPI report or the president's action plan, I do think that there are great opportunities to advance the agenda and to build on a plan that does have bipartisan support. And I think there is broad recognition that at the end of the day, this is certainly good for the planet, but there's a reason that Walmart's making these investments. There's a reason that Nike and so many Fortune 500 companies are also advancing this. They know this is good for jobs and the bottom line. And I think we just need to find a way to move that conversation forward. And I think that's what the president intends to do.
And I think on the politics, you're already seeing the country lead Washington on this, which is typical. The country's already decided we need to move forward on this. Now a majority of Republicans want to tackle this issue. A big majority of independents and, of course, Democrats have been there for a while. So I think you'll see Washington follow this in the near future. I think Heather's right. The more discussion today and the president leading on this, the better off we're going to be as people understand the decisions in front of them and become a more informed consumer of this information. They will demand action, and I think that's what you're going to see in the near future. There's already consensus on some of these things. You see bipartisanship building in the Senate on some of the things that we talked about today, and I think this will become more and more. Because here's the truth: our economic competitors around the world are acting on this, and they are already beginning to make changes that will give them an economic advantage in the next 10 and 20 years, and we can't get left behind. And there's an economic incentive for us to deal with these issues, to compete in the global marketplace. And there's a political incentive for both parties to understand that there is a political will out there to tackle these issues and to do it in a way that puts politics aside and puts our country first. And I think hopefully you'll see action from Washington to match that will.
Well, I have to readily admit I don't understand politics. In fact, many years ago, I was in this fine city, and I left because I was thoroughly confused. No, seriously. I do think what I do see out at Stanford is a good example. Some of the most forceful people on climate, at least not forceful, we got to do this, but we really ought to be taking climate very seriously. These people are Republicans. So I've sort of scratched my head and say, well, what's different going on in California than elsewhere? Now, obviously, a lot of Democrats are also saying that as well. But these are really good Republicans with bona fide credentials saying we got to look at this issue, climate change, and we got to do something. What I see happening in this report is it's sort of like, suppose you were to convince people of all persuasions that we really should be doing something, and what kind of solution would you have to it? I see many of the things being proposed in this report as something that Republicans would gladly want to own. So for those Republicans who believe that climate is an important issue, I think that these people will actually grab a hold of this. And I think some of the other comments are also consistent on some of the other comments that we've had on the panel. So I think that's the issue that I see, is that there's an apparent gap there, but I don't understand that gap. I think it's narrowing, and I think that this study does have some things that people can grab a hold of that people could do. And probably other types of policies which we haven't even looked at, which would also fit that category.
One of the most important political lessons I learned was to know what you don't know. And I don't know what it will take to get policy to move forward in a nonpartisan way. But I do think, and I would suggest, that the three people here on my left are professionally very profoundly involved with the reasons why we can be hopeful, not as just a dream, but on reality. With Heather Zichal, we representing a president who took the bold action to take the steps as the chief executive to do something about an issue that is a concern to all Americans, regardless of party, and to put it at the top of America's agenda. And that's what he has the power to do, to put it on top of the agenda and take action. Jim Messina, who knows at the base of the grassroots where America is going, and both generationally and not geographically, but across a broad area. We're seeing people understand that climate change is a very real problem and not a power issue. It's a question of their lives and our success as a society. And Hill Huntington, as a dedicated scholar and academic who understands that if we are to address these issues, we need to do it with solid, sound science and good economics and some careful analysis. So I think that's why it can be done, and you just feel it. Will it happen? Not necessarily, but it sure should and could.
Well, let me thank all of our panelists and thank Dr. Hurley again for being our host. With that, we'll wrap this up, and let me invite everyone to stay for lunch. And thank you all again for coming.